Guys, I am sorry that I had to re-record this. Um, we are going to be looking at a review of the American Revolution. This is by no means an all-encompassing kind of lesson. It's a very brief, quick review of the American Revolution. So let's begin. First off, when we talk about the American Revolution, it's important to point out that here in the United States, we call it the Revolutionary War, but if you go somewhere else, they're not going to call it the Revolutionary War. For example, if you say the Revolutionary War in France, they're thinking of the French Revolution. You say the revolution in Russia, they're thinking of the Russian Revolution. And China, same thing. You get the point. So the technically correct name is the American Revolution. Here in the United States, it's also known as the War for Independence. Fighting between British soldiers and the American patriots began April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord, which is just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. The war's last major battle was at Yorktown, Virginia, during September and October of 1781. Britain formally recognized America's independence with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, September 3rd, 1783. There were skirmishes between 1781 and 1783. One of them happened relatively close to here at Fort Henry. Now, you guys don't know it as Fort Henry today. You know it as Wheeling, West Virginia. That's where Fort Henry was. There was a skirmish there in 1782. Britain was deeply in debt following the French and Indian War, and they had this new reality. They had become the world's strongest empire. Mercantilism had achieved its goal with the British. They had gained control of India. They had become the most dominant country in Europe. They had this vast North American colony stretching from the Arctic Ocean, literally, to the Gulf of Mexico. When you're saying, well, the United States didn't touch the Arctic Ocean, you're right. But Canada did, and Canada was part of the British Empire as well. They're also making discoveries, and they literally became a global empire. And being a global empire requires to pay a vast army and navy, and that's expensive. And so the colonists were expected to pay for this. And with the increase of taxes and laws restricting their migration west, these events are going to lead to eventually the American colonists who in 1754 would have considered themselves British, to a generation later being willing to take up arms and fight and declare themselves independent and free of the British. That's a big change. If you think about it, that's a huge change. What caused that huge change? Well, Americans had enjoyed a great deal of freedom until the end of the French and Indian War. They resented new taxes being placed on them without representation in Parliament. What they wanted initially was to have representation in British Parliament. That's kind of the equivalent of the American Congress. There are technical differences. We're not going to get into that. You don't need to know that in sixth grade. But it's about the equivalent of Americans' Congress. And we here in the Americas wanted representation in the British Parliament. Well, the British Parliament did not allow colonies to have representation. And so this cry of no taxation without representation becomes prevalent throughout the American colonies. The first thing that really angered the colonists, especially in Virginia, was the Proclamation of 1763. What was that French and Indian War fought over? Remember, you had to watch all those videos about it. So what was it fought over? Well, it was land in the Ohio River Valley. And so that's what the American colonists were fighting for. That war, which started in the wilderness of North America, spread to become a global war all over the world. The rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War. Here in the Americas, we call it the French and Indian War. After winning that war, American colonists were like, hip, hip, hooray, we're going to get to settle the land of the Ohio River Valley, the best farmland in the world. They hadn't settled west of there yet. They hadn't discovered what the Midwest had to offer, but they knew the Ohio River Valley had rich farmland and had ample water and fish and game, and they were excited to settle there. And King George, in his great wisdom, decided to forbid the settlement of the Ohio River Valley and forbade colonists to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, this angered a lot of colonists, including George Washington. Then in 1764, Parliament places a 3-cent penny tax on each gallon of molasses. Now, molasses is a way to get sugar. And so this became known as the Sugar Act of 1764. What the colonists did was they decided not to buy any sugar from the British, and they smuggled it in, and they boycotted sugar. So this act was repealed. And then Parliament, in its great wisdom, decided to look at the outlook and what will American colonists definitely buy? Well, American colonists were the most literate people on earth in the 1700s. The common American was more educated than the common Englander. Fact, education was highly valued, especially in New England. One of the reasons is because New England was settled by religious immigrants, and the descendants of the Pilgrims and the Puritans believed it was important to learn to read and write because you needed to be able to read the Bible. And so that emphasis on reading permeated American culture into newspapers being developed and books being written, and you get the point. Americans ferociously read compared to the rest of the world. And so Parliament decided to create the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required colonists to pay for a tax on newspapers, books, and even legal documents like marriage. Well, what did the American colonists do? A lot of them chose not to get married because they weren't going to pay that tax. Instead, they just entered in common law relationships, which before that tax would have been considered extremely sinful and taboo. Also, they chose to smuggle their literature and create secret printing presses around the Philadelphia area, especially. Parliament abolished this act because they could see it was futile. In 1766, your common law marriage people got married and, legally after that, but it became a big deal. But a year later, the Townshend Acts were placed, and they were on imported goods. So these are only goods coming from outside the Americas into the Americas. And what were they? Glass, lead, paint, and paper. Glass, European glass was highly valued. Lead was needed to make all kinds of things, including bullets for those American guns. Yes. And paper, because, Americans needed their paper if they were going to read. So Americans responded by simply boycotting British goods. We're just not going to buy British stuff, which was illegal. So in 1773, the British passed the Tea Act. What did Americans do? Well, we do what we always do. We cheat. We smuggled in, we smuggled in goods from other countries, especially the Netherlands. Smuggling is a crime. Okay, that means we are bringing stuff into the country illegally. We use the word smuggling when we're talking about the drug trade today. Well, the drug of choice, so to speak, for Americans in 1773 was tea. Okay, we don't really usually think of it as tea, but technically it is. It's got caffeine. In 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act, which made it possible for the East India Company to sell tea below the price of smuggled tea. Now, Britain believed the colonists would buy English tea since it was cheaper. But the Americans were not biting. So on December 16th, 1773, Samuel Adams led patriots disguised as Native Americans on a raid of British ships docked in Boston Harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. In response, the British passed the Intolerable Acts. At least that's what it was called here in the Americas. We called it the Intolerable Acts. It's also known as the Coercive Acts. Coerce means to force to see your point of view. And the British closed Boston Harbor until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. It was, in today's money, millions of dollars worth of tea, which wasn't going to be paid quickly. Another one took away all the rights of the state legislatures and replaced them with appointed royal governors, especially in Massachusetts, where it was General Thomas Gage. Well, the First Continental Congress will meet September and October of 1774. Now keep track of the timeline in your head. 1774, and 12 of the 13 colonies meet, except Georgia. Georgia did not come to this First Continental Congress. They met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia to protest the Intolerable Acts. Their representatives decided to stop trade with Britain unless the acts were abolished. They also advised colonists to prepare for war. They agreed to meet again in May 1775. Well, between October 1774 and May of 1775, some changes are going to happen. More British regulars were sent over, and they were referred to as red coats. So the Americas had been militarized. Now, the colonies did not have a central government, army, or navy. Each colony did have a small citizen army called a militia. Now, militia are volunteer soldiers. They work other jobs. They're farmers, they're craftsmen, they're businessmen. They work the printing press. Oh, by the way, they also are ready to fight in a minute's notice. So because of this readiness in a minute's notice, they became known as the Minutemen. The Minutemen. Massachusetts became famous for its Minutemen. Early 1775, we're starting to get to April, early spring, and General Gage received orders to arrest the troublemakers of the Boston area. Patriots learned about the orders, and they fled the city of Boston. And Gage found out the Americans had stored arms and gunpowder in Concord, Massachusetts. Joseph Warren, a Boston patriot, discovered Gage's plan. He sent 3 carriers, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, to ride and warn the citizens. Nearly 150 years later, the poet William Wordsworth Longfellow told the story of the famous ride and referred to it as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Now, it's got a few little inaccuracies, but we still love this poem. In fact, I'm going to have you read it next week. But simply put, Samuel Prescott is actually the main one who was doing the writing that day. Also, we remember it as the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. Well, you got to remember in 1775, we were British. So it was probably more the redcoats are coming. The redcoats are coming. When the redcoats reached Lexington, 70 Minutemen were waiting. It is not known who fired first, but whoever fired first, it is today remembered as the shot heard round the world. Unless you're a Giants or Dodgers fan, then the shot heard around the world is the home run that the Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. I'm a Dodger fan. I hate that. Giants fans. My uncle's a Giants fan. He loves that. That's off subject. You guys can look that up on your own. But the shot heard around the world was the shot fired at Lexington. What we do know is the results. 8 Minutemen were killed and 10 were wounded. 1 British soldier was injured. The British continued toward Concord. Again, Minutemen met them. 3 redcoats and 2 patriots were killed. When the British began to march back to Boston, Minutemen fired at them from behind trees and bushes, and about 250 British were wounded. American losses were around 90. The war had begun. Of course, if you're going to win a war, you gotta have weapons. And, the Americans, again, they're Minutemen. They're common everyday business people. So they had weapons and they had their own, bullets and stuff, but, most people don't stockpile large amounts. What we would consider as citizens a large amount for a war is not a large amount, okay? So they had just transferred from a citizen life of armament to now we're at war. You need a lot more weaponry than what the Minutemen had, which is why Fort Ticonderoga was important. In May 1775, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold led a militia against Fort Ticonderoga and captured the nearby Crown Point. These 2 victories supplied Americans with much needed artillery. They got cannons, they got gunpowder, they got bullets and balls for the cannons and all those things that you can think of. This was much needed. All right, you guys just look at the questions on the slide, and you can pause at each one of those and just see those questions are not required to be turned in. Those questions are just there for you to go back through. If there's something there you don't know, hey, I need to go back and see where I can find it. I'm going to put the PowerPoint on your, I'm going to download that also. So this is the part with the audio on it where I'm talking. And you can go back through the non-audio and find anything you need to find. All right, so between the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, you have an America that is preparing for war, and now by the Second Continental Congress, you have an America that is at war, but they still have not declared independence. It's only 1775, and if you know anything about American history at all, you know that the Declaration of Independence is not signed until July 1776. That's a full year and a couple months later. So, what's happening during that time? Well, you're going to have battles fought against the British. You're going to have skirmishes out on the frontier. You're going to have petitions sent from the Second Continental Congress, and King George is continually ignoring them. And support for American independence is continuing to grow. It's important to note, though, that not everybody in the Americas supported America breaking away from Britain and becoming independent. In fact, a third of the people here in the Americas were loyalists. They would proclaim themselves to be loyalists. Of course, the Patriots didn't call them loyalists. They were Tories. Tory was like the bad word for loyalist. More than 1/3 of the colonists didn't really care either way. I mean, think of the election right now. You probably have a third of the people who are really supporting, Donald Trump. And you have a third of the people who are supporting Joe Biden, and they hate the other side. And then you have people like in the middle. They just really don't care one way or the other because they don't like either one of them. Okay? Or they like both of them. But in this case, it's probably they don't like either one of them. It's the same during the American Revolution. There were people here in the Americas who really didn't like the Patriots or the Loyalists. They're like, whatever, go fight your little war, just leave my farm alone. I'm here for my family. I'm not here for your little conflict of who's going to rule. I don't care. I rule my farm. Okay? You get the point. And that's about 40% of the people. That's over a third. So you have less than a third of the people who were, quote unquote, patriots, ready to fight and break away. Now you had more patriots up in New England, but you had more loyalists down in the South. But it was this odd mix of politics going on at that time. In Philadelphia, the Congress established the Continental Army. So that was the first, before they declared independence, they declared an army. They decided that no state or colony, it wasn't a state yet, no colony could form an army big enough to fight the mighty British Empire. And they were right. They had to join together. And they chose a commander-in-chief. And the honor went to George Washington. Why was George Washington chosen? He had general experience during the French and Indian War. Yeah, he lost a lot of his battles, but he had training. Nobody else did. And that's where the French and Indian War really came into play during this American Revolution. This is where George Washington steps to the forefront. Soon, Congress appointed 13 other generals. We're not going to go through all those. You don't need to know them, okay? You do eventually, but not at 6th grade. What you do have to understand is one of the big problems is they had to recruit funds. And how do they get funds? They have no power to tax. So they began issuing a currency called Continental dollars that they wanted Americans to use. Again, remember, 40% of Americans did not care one way or the other who won the war. And a third of them were loyalists. They used British currency. So what ended up happening was the Continental dollars were worthless. So they relied on loans from citizens and other nations, especially France, the Netherlands, and Spain, who wanted to see the British lose their colonies. They had a vested interest in this. And Ben Franklin, this is where he comes into the fray. By this time, Ben Franklin is an older man. And it's important to point that out. He wasn't going to do a lick of good out in the battlefield. But what he could do was he could sway public opinion in Europe, where his writings were actually very popular. He had written Poor Richard's Almanac, and he was a great scientist, and he learned about the electricity and lightning. So he was actually a highly respected person in Europe, and kind of was the anti-Yankee Doodle. We talked about what Yankee Doodle originally meant. It was a lazy American. He was a very cultured man from the Americas, and he was able to sway public opinion. And one of the ways he was able to sway public opinion actually was he was very popular with the European ladies. They liked him. And so they encouraged their husbands to listen to him. All right, here's some questions again. You can use them to just check your notes. Again, I'm not taking the questions as and answers as an assignment. Now, both the British and the Americans wanted to occupy the hills overlooking Boston, because if you could occupy those hills, you could control Boston Harbor, and Boston Harbor was a very rich and important harbor. So on July 17, 1775, British troops under General Howe attacked so as to not waste powder or shot. The Americans were ordered to wait as the British regulars marched towards them. Now, this is basically a suicide order because the British regulars were the best shots in the world. The Americans were ordered not to fire until they could see the whites of their eyes. In other words, they had to be within a few feet. So here are the British shooting at their lines, and the Americans are lined up, not fighting back, but not flinching either. Why did they wait? They didn't have enough ammunition. That's what it boiled down to. The Patriots fought until they ran out. They made the biggest dent they could, and then they had to retreat. This battle became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. And even though it was a win, General Howe is quoted as saying something along the lines of, many more victories like this will be the loss of this war. Now, not all North American colonies joined the fight, only 13. Now, you're like, wait a minute, I thought there were only 13. No, there were colonies to the north of what is today the United States. What country do you think they became? That's right, they became Canada. They became Canada. And by becoming Canada, they became a different country because they stayed loyal to the British. So Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, and Quebec, they all remained loyal to the British during this conflict. Benedict Arnold was led a force towards Quebec. Eventually, he's going to change his mind, and ironically, he's going to end up moving to Canada. General Washington wanted control of those hills around Boston. And so he had ordered a very daring plan, a plan to move all the captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga across snow-covered mountains to Dorchester Heights. Now, this is a long trek. Fort Ticonderoga is on the border, basically, of the state of New York, Vermont, and Canada. It's up Rundling, Champlain area. It's close to there. It's for the sake of discussion. And to march all that stuff in the winter to Boston is not an easy trek, and yet it was accomplished. And so this allowed George Washington to lay siege to the British in Boston on March 4th, 1776. General Howe and his troops left Boston. 9,000 British soldiers sailed to Halifax, which is in the nation of Canada today. Washington then sent his troops south from Boston to New York. All this was happening, March and all these battles. By the summer of 1776, it was very clear there was no turning back. The Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a document declaring the colonies to be free and independent states. And even though it was a committee, that was assigned to it, it's very clear the author of our Declaration of Independence was none other than Thomas Jefferson. And I get to claim this honor. It's really an honor to be able to say this. I'm the seventh great grandnephew of Thomas Jefferson. That's a whole other story, and I don't want to bore you too much, but he is the author of our Declaration of Independence, and it was adopted on July 4th, 1776. That's a date you have to know. July 4th, 1776. Make sure you know it. That's why we have Independence Day on July 4th. That's why we shoot off fireworks and all that good stuff. Okay. So go through and look through these questions. Now, days before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, General Howe returned from Halifax in New York City with new reinforcements. He quickly drove the Patriots out of Brooklyn Heights in New York City. Nathan Hale, which was a patriot and a young Connecticut school teacher, was spying behind enemy lines, and he was caught and of course, hanged for treason. Of course, he gets to give his last words and testament, and he said in his last words, "I regret I have but one life to lose for my country." The British then were, after capturing New York City, Washington troops withdrew to New Jersey. General Cornwallis attacked them in New Jersey, and they had to go across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, George Washington was in desperate need of a victory. And so, on Christmas Day, Christmas night, he orders his men to cross the Delaware River back into New Jersey and to attack the Hessians early December 26th. Well, there was a reason he chose this date. The Hessians had a habit on Christmas night of drinking copious amounts of alcohol. He knew they'd be hungover and not ready to fight. And so, in this Battle of Trenton, he attacked and captured 900 Hessian soldiers. Cornwallis marched down towards Trenton. Washington's troops secretly slipped past the British attacker on January 3rd at Princeton, and the Americans were victorious. These two victories were very important for the American cause. If they had been lost, it's very well that many of the men whose enlistment time was starting to run out would not have re-enlisted. However, with these victories, these men re-enlisted. All right, take a quick look at these questions here. And that's the end of part 1. And I will make part 2 later, and I will post that to YouTube. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.